Good afternoon and welcome to What's Underneath the Iceberg, Unpacking ACEs and Addressing Structural Inequities. Again, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. My name is Rhonda Alexander from the Networks of Opportunity for Child Wellbeing, and we are so happy to have you all with us today. So as we get started, I just would like to share a couple of tips to remember as you've entered the webinar, as you've entered today's session. All your microphones will be muted, so not to worry. If you have a question or if something comes up that you'd like to share with the presenters or share with the organizers, please use a chat box, and there's a chat option there. You can also submit questions via the dashboard. You can submit those questions throughout the webinar, and then we will be recording this particular session and posting slides afterwards, so everything will be available. And just in case you want to see where you can submit questions, as I mentioned, you can submit questions throughout the course of the webinar. However, we won't begin answering questions until after both of our presenters have shared the information that they'll be sharing with us today. I'd love to give you an overview of what we're going to do today and what you're going to hear and experience. So, of course, we'll do a brief introduction now, and I will talk about the Vital Village Network and the Networks of Opportunity for Child Wellbeing, just providing a short overview. And then we'll hear from two amazing speakers. And then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end before we close out. So just a little bit about the Vital Village Network. It's a local network here in Boston that's really committed to maximizing child, family, and community well-being. The work began in 2010, focusing on 3 neighborhoods in the Boston area, Dorchester, Mattapan, and Roxbury, focused on providing service learning and leadership, a trauma-informed lens to align systems, and iterative improvement and data sharing, so constantly moving forward. And if you're interested in learning more about the Vital Village Network, please feel free to visit us at www.vitalvillage.org. The Networks of Opportunity for Child Wellbeing has grown out of the Vital Village work, and it's a national initiative focused on improving and building capacity of local community coalitions to advance health equity and child wellbeing across the country. And I'll just show you a map of where we're working in just a moment. We also have the Now Innovation Forum, which is a national network of peer communities and folks working across the country to really transform what health equity and child wellbeing looks like in their particular community. It's a great repository of resources and a place to have conversations. So we hope that you will visit us there. Just a little bit more about the Now Learning community, working in 10 communities across the country. You can see a map of those here, and you can perhaps learn from those communities through the Now Online Forum. And here's where you can visit us at the forum at www.networksofopportunity.org. So I hope following today's webinar that you'll join us there and share more questions and comments and really join the national conversation around health equity and child well-being. So with that in mind, again, my name is Rhonda Alexander. I'm the Director of Operations for the Networks of Opportunity for Child Wellbeing here at the Vital Village Network. And I'm so excited about this for you all to hear from the wonderful speakers you'll be hearing from today. We have Nakatris Perkins, who's a Senior Strategist at Ubuntu Research and Evaluation. And so really going to share some fantastic information. So I'm super excited for you all to hear from her, as well as Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett, who's an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Boston University School of Medicine and also the founding director of the Vital Village Network, and has really been doing this work for a long time. If you're interested in learning more about our speakers, feel free to take a look at your dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a little button that says Handouts. You can find the bios of both of our speakers. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Nakatris Perkins, and we'll hear from her for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll immediately following Nakatris, we'll hear from Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett. So thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy today as much as we do. Nakatris, take it away.
All right, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm really excited to be here and be with you all in all these different places. I love webinars. So my name again is Nakatris Perkins from Ubuntu Research and Evaluation. We are a professional learning community that uses liberation and beloved community frameworks to really evaluate, facilitate, and strategize individuals, organizations, and communities. One of the ways we do that is we do talk about ACEs and how diverse childhood experiences can really affect a community. So we're working on how individual, family, and communities affect household dysfunction in particular, as that's pointed out as part of the way that adverse childhood experiences are really shed light in that way. I do want to say that though we look at the dysfunction, household dysfunction as the term that is used for ACEs, it is not how we necessarily think about it in the same way. So household dysfunction is, as I'm sure many of you know, they think about some of the financial restraints of a family, or people going to being imprisoned. Think about educational spaces, just how the household functions in a lot of different ways, and thinking about it dysfunctional because it's not allowing young people to have the best experience. And so we don't think that abnormalities are necessarily all because of what's happening in the household, but because of the supports that are missing for families and children. So in thinking about this, we spend a lot of time talking about beloved community and dignity and how we can promote resiliency in that household to interrupt the dysfunctions that are happening throughout our communities to change the experiences of young people. So I'm going to talk about two things. One is a little bit about beloved community. We look at 8 practices that will allow us to build those things. And there's 2 in particular that we really think help promote resiliency. One is the struggle with fear, and the other is moving towards liberation. So when we think about the struggle with fear, we are all have some types of fears in our lives. And what happens is we often navigate around those fears. So avoiding things, making sure we don't do things, and communities are set up in that space. So I can talk about how, there's certain ways a young person shouldn't walk home. Even on my block, there's certain ways that might not make the most sense for a young person to walk home because of how the block is set up, how the block is lit. When we talk about those things, though, and we don't talk about the fact that our alley isn't lit, even though in just using my neighborhood, it would make the most sense to walk. There's a school directly behind my house. It makes the most sense to walk through the alley to get home. If you do that in the winter time, I live in the Midwest where it is very dark now at 5 o'clock. It's not well lit. And that could be easily, all these things can happen. Crime happens. All these experiences can happen because of that. But we ask young people to navigate around it. And so we need to struggle with the fear of not necessarily, yes, walking through the alley, let's go around, take the longer route. But what does it look like to struggle with the fear around speaking truth to power in our communities? Talking to my aldermen, talking to community leaders, talking to the mayor, talking to neighborhood organizations about getting more lights in the alley. And that's some of the fear that people need to wrestle with. The fear of being turned away, the fear of not being smart enough or powerful enough to speak up in those spaces, because it allows us in much larger scales to navigate around things that really would address some of the experiences that young people have. Another thing is moving towards liberation. Moving towards liberation sounds like a humongous idea that we really need to focus on, and it is, but also it's also just really struggling and not getting comfortable with how we have experienced oppression and how we are oppressed in our day-to-day lives. So being a young person, there are times when young people don't feel comfortable speaking up around, what, it would be shorter for me to walk through the alley. Is it possible to get more lights? That's not something that a young person says. Young people are often told to be quiet. They're not listened to. The amount of times that I've been in spaces where a young person has said something, and days, weeks, maybe even moments, but usually days, weeks later, an adult repeats that in a much louder, in a space that's better heard, in a meeting. And that's the same idea that a young person had. So what does it look like to empower young people and to empower parents who might not have the same resources or the ability, because they're not a coalition, they're a family, right? It's one mom, one dad, one grandparent, one aunt, one uncle, a guardian. What does it look like for them to feel that they are able to move towards not being comfortable in that space, and for community organizations to empower them and engage them in ways that makes it clear that we all want liberation? And so I'm going to help you struggle with fear, and I'm going to help make space for you to be comfortable in being something other than what society has labeled you to be able to do, or to be skilled in doing, or to have permission to do. So those two things very largely in thinking about how to promote resiliency around the households for childhood experiences are two things we focus on. The biggest thing I think we focus on, though, I think is dignity. So thinking about dignity and dignified relationships. Dignity as a mutual sense of worthiness, or a sense of how worthy I am in relation to how worthy others are in my community, and what it would look like for everyone to feel like they are worthy. And because I am worthy, you are worthy. Or for some people to know that because you are worthy, I am worthy. Again, thinking about some of the power structures in communities, some of the power structures in even households that don't allow everyone in the picture to be able to talk, understand, and move forward. The biggest part of that, especially for young people, is what we call restorative dignity. And those are those pieces of dignity that you are born with, right? So we come into the world and we have self-determination, we have nobility or rank, and we have humanity. And over time, a lot of that is squelched. It is pushed aside. It is told that it can only be used in certain ways. And so what I mean by that, when I think about self-determination, or talk about self-determination, talking about the ability to control one's life and livelihood and to define our world in our own terms. So thinking about, think about those 2-year-olds. When a 2-year-old is like, I got it. I'm good. Please stop. I can do it. No. How many toddlers really concentrate on no? I'm good in this space, and I'm going to be able to do what I'm trying to do, and I don't need your help, nor do I want you to share with what I have going on. And we spend a lot of time trying to put that in a box and make sure that young people know that there are rules and regulations and policies and procedures, and not that there shouldn't be, but how can we restore the self-determination of families? So maybe whether that's a young parent or guardian, whether that's an elder who for so long has been told these are things that you don't have the power and control over doing, that really affect your everyday life and experiences, and what are community organizations doing to engage and empower families in that way. The other two, again, are rank or nobility and humanity. So thinking about nobility, to acknowledge everyone, including ourselves, as worthy of the highest honor and respect. So what does it look like when a family comes into organizations that we're able to serve through, right? Oftentimes, like even something as simple as we ask questions in spaces, people will say, oh, how are your clients? In a way that I am, because I'm able to serve you and you are being served. We put a rank there, but how come? Right? Like there are things that, yes, I have formal education and experience that allows me to be able to assist you in ways. There's also ways you can be assisted. Also ways I can be assisted by you, and our companies, our organizations, our communities, our neighbors, our country puts rank in that in a way that doesn't allow people to see themselves and to acknowledge themselves worthy of honor and respect. And if I don't do that, then I don't give myself that. And oftentimes I don't offer it to others. And dignity is reciprocal. So I need to understand that, and that would be the only way that I can offer it to others. And what can we do to restore that in communities? And then lastly is humanity, just to validate the inherent value that we have for one another through a shared human experience. Again, I think of toddlers and how they see people, like you're going to the grocery store, you're on corners or bus stops, young people say hi all the time. The younger the young person, the more likely they are to speak or smile or wave or look at you and wonder what your shirt is or how your hair is and listen to the bangles on your wrist. And we spend time going, don't look, turn your head, be quiet, don't talk to strangers, focus on me, oh, leave the lady alone. All those things that we do to try to remove that validation that there's a value to having a shared human experience. So I'm thinking about restorative dignity. How can we as organizations and community members really spend time returning, like the action of returning something to its place, its owner, to give that back to families and young people so that they don't experience adverse childhood experiences aren't happening, and that families feel empowered based on all of the wonderful opportunities that they're given through the organizations that we happen to work for, or some of the education we've had or access we have to things. How can we get to a place where it is respected, protected, and fulfilled consistently as we work to make sure that families are good in that space? I am going to pause there. I know that Dr. Renee is going to come on and give us some other information, and be more than welcome and excited to answer questions and really dig into more as we go into the question and answer portion. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Nakatris. We can't wait to hear from Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett. And here's just a little bit of information about some additional resources from Ubuntu Research and Evaluation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nikatris. I think you provided such a deep and profound framework for the start of our conversation today, of really thinking about the connection between dignity and the way in which dignity is realized for individuals within society as a strategy for us to actually truly address ACEs and structural violence. So as we think about it, we now have an unprecedented amount of data and information that is sharing a resounding conclusion that there's an enduring impact of early childhood adversities on health, development, well-being, and life chances across the life course. And as Nikatra shared, ACEs are, in the terminology of the CDC definition in the ACEs study, really focused on indicators of household dysfunction, exposure to physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, mental health issues of a parent or caregiver, family divorce, parental divorce. There were a limited number of factors, didn't include poverty, didn't include racism. Over time, there has been more research that has broadened our scope. And ahead of the ACEs study, there was a tremendous body of literature that contributed to our understanding of factors, both interpersonal forms of violence and adversity, familial forms of violence and adversity, and forms of violence and adversity that exist at the community level as well, such as community violence and systemic violence that contributes to health and well-being. In addition to that, we have historical traumas, we have intergenerational experiences of trauma. So there are a broad number of factors that are contributing to our understanding of how adversities can impact well-being over time. When we look at the impact of adverse childhood experiences on the common forms of mental health, physical health, and well-being conditions, we see a profound impact. And it has driven us to really seek to understand better what would explain the mechanisms for how adverse childhood experiences have such a profound impact over time on such a range of different health and wellness measures. Importantly, we cannot think about adverse childhood experiences as occurring in isolation of the community environments and ecosystems where children are growing. So there are conditions of the social environment that can be both health promoting as well as adverse. There are community institutions, opportunity structures, and properties that can be transformative and buffering of early childhood adversities, and at the same time can have a synergistic negative impact or a cumulative negative impact. So when we think about neighborhood environments and community conditions, we think about the composition of the neighborhood, who lives in the community. We think about contextual factors such as the opportunity structures, the built environment, the area resources, the economy. But we also think about collective properties within environments. What are the social attributes of communities? So communities are more than just the sum of individuals within the community. There are collective properties that emerge from social cohesion and social interactions. As we've thought a lot about our stories, our conventional stories of adverse childhood experiences, of ways in which inequity and injustice exist and are perpetuated within society, I compare it to this model of this aquarium. As we look into a large aquarium, we see the fish swimming, we get totally wrapped up in the idea that we are observing life as it is underwater, that this is the existence and experience of life underwater. But we often fail to recognize that there is a glass, there's a tank, There's an aquarium that actually is determining and dictating and influencing the way in which the fish swim, the behaviors that we see among them, and the interactions that they have with each other. And when I think about what we would call systemic and structural violence, the way in which systems and social structures can cause harm and disadvantage to individuals, I often think of this glass because structural violence is often invisible to us. And Paul Farmer initially coined that term to really kind of describe ways in which social structures and systems can inflict harm among populations and it contribute to inequities, but are often missed and are often not acknowledged. And Helena Hansen has described the practice of structural competency, which is an effort to question, look for, constantly seek to identify these structures. How do we make them visible for ourselves? And how do we utilize that to help us better understand the experience of adversity in childhood and strategies to prevent and mitigate adversities? So when we think about structural violence, we could think about institutional racism, Jim Crow laws, redlining, community divestment. Often when we are working and partnering with communities many years later, it is invisible, the long historical process and the continued effects, the continued systemic and structural violence that exists as a result of that. We also think about this around historical and community trauma. So as we think about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, we broaden our lens to really think about structural violence on a systems level as well. So when we begin to start to define this, we are looking at this iceberg, and I would describe the ACEs that we capture and that we measure as the events that are at the very, very top, that are above the water level. And then as we begin to look below or at the water level, we start to see patterns, neighborhood patterns, community patterns, where ACEs or adversities are occurring at higher rates and trends. So when we just see the events, we can only react to them. When we see the patterns and trends, we can begin to anticipate those patterns and trends and begin to structure our programs and policies to better address them. But we really have to go further at the underlying structures that are really contributing to those patterns and trends. And we need to design new systems and structures. But we also have to think about what is keeping the water cold. And those are our mental models, our cultural practices, our norms. And the mental models and cultural practices have the ability to work towards really positive structures, positive patterns and trends, but they also can contribute to more negative and inequitable systems as well. So as Nakatra spoke about the concept of dignity and how it is actualized in your experience of your community environment, your familial relations, your relations and ways of being within the world, that really arises from a series of mental models about the value of different individuals, the worthiness of individuals within our communities. So as we begin to think about the very long shadow that can be cast by early childhood adversities, we have to recognize the iceberg and utilize it as a framework to help us go deeper to understand the events that we're seeing and the patterns and trends that we're seeing. We have to start to unpack what is not going to be visible, which relates to systemic inequities and structural violence. So it is commonplace that epidemics disproportionately affect those who are at the social margins of society. So if you are experiencing discrimination, prejudice, poverty, and chronic disadvantage, and exposed to adversities beyond those systemic adversities, you will be more likely to have a compounded impact. So we also have to think about other ways inequities exist in systems in terms of access to care, to resources that can also unequally burden the ultimate health and well-being chances. So as we work to achieve a more just and equitable world, we have to develop counter stories that help us unpack the levels below the water level. And beloved community is one of the frameworks that can help us. Oftentimes, members of the community that we are partnering with in our efforts have a strong sense of service, a strong investment in community, a strong social justice orientation, and a desire both to help, to educate, but also to learn from. So they come to the table with strong leadership skills. What gets in the way of our effective partnerships? Many of you may be familiar with this quote that those closest to the solution are often furthest from the resources and the power. And this is a common phenomenon that we're experiencing, that those who really have the solutions and are closest to the solutions are not put in position to truly make the necessary changes and improvements that would contribute to greater well-being and capacity for communities to promote well-being. So when embracing the beloved community framework, Nakatra shared some of the principles of the framework and how those principles show up in practices. So the practice of recognizing and honoring the dignity of every person is one we often struggle with. When we think of dignity, as Nakatra has defined it, as the state or quality of being worthy of honor or respect, well, we struggle to actually actualize this for every member of our society, for every human. How do you value yourself, and how does your community value you? Both contribute to the sense of dignity. So it's not something that can be created independent of your experience of the world. So dignity is understood in the context of networks, relationships, and societal experiences, which is why structural violence becomes such an insidious way of undermining dignity. Nakatra also shared these elements, the inalienable elements of dignity around self-determination, humility, and nobility, as well as the elements of dignity that are actualized more intentionally through the lived experiences where we affirm or negate a sense of dignity. And so as we think about restorative dignity, how does our understanding of the iceberg and the structural violence that exists below the surface in our systems and practices show up in affirming or negating senses of dignity? We struggle to affirm the dignity of adults, and often when we use the word and term dignity, we are imagining, envisioning, and thinking of an adult. But I'd like you all just to take a moment to think about the dignity of a child. To what extent are our policies, our practices, our ways of being affirming or negating the inherent worthiness and dignity of children within our society? And this gives me pause as someone who, like many of you on the phone, has contributed my service, my life, my career to really trying to improve and protect and honor the life and value of children in our society. But are some of those strategies actually in some ways undermining their inherent dignity and worthiness? So we return to the iceberg to really think about the mental models. What are the ways in which we think about children in this society? What are our cultural and normative practices for how children are treated, valued, and considered that may be undermining dignity? So as we work to improve child health and educational equity, we have to begin much further down with transforming the way in which we are thinking and the norms and practices that are being encouraged that are truly driving our systems and structures. We can begin higher up with trying to program around this, but it actually is not changing the ways of thinking. So the invitation is then to begin to think about an equity approach. So if you were to think about respecting, protecting, and fulfilling a sense of dignity for individuals, families, and communities, how would we operate differently as a movement that is trying to advance and promote child well-being and prevent adversities? If our goal, if our approach to equity was specified with the goals of respecting, protecting, and fulfilling a sense of dignity for children, for individuals, for families, and for communities, there are a number of things we would do together that would be different. So now the invitation, what is it that we could do together and do differently? So I'd like to share an example from our work locally. Through Vital Village, we anchor and focus on building community capacity to promote child well-being. So the first strategy is to begin with the premise and the approach that solutions already exist within communities. This is a dignity orientation in that there is already leadership, ideas, and value that perhaps we've failed to recognize. That could be scaled up and spread for a greater good. Next, we think about trauma-informed framework. What meaning would an understanding of ACEs and structural violence, historical, interpersonal, and community trauma add to the work that we are doing? Can that understanding help drive us towards different ways of aligning, working together, and being in relation together, and preserving dignity and restoring, as Nakatra said, dignity? Next, can we be transparent about this? Are we going to own up to curating and sharing and disseminating data and information about our strengths and weaknesses, about the extent to which we succeed or don't succeed in respecting, protecting, and fulfilling dignity? And sometimes that appears in our practices, sometimes that appears in our interrelationships, our level of trust, our partnerships. Finally, we focus on iterative improvement and the idea that as we understand the dignity framework and the concept of beloved a community, these are strivings. So over time, we're never there fully. We are always working towards and striving towards, as Nakatra shared, struggling with fear. Well, that might be an ongoing process of embracing the idea that fear may be present and it may hinder our ability to work together, but we need to work towards that. So for us locally, this really reveals itself as a service, learning, and leadership model where members of the community are invited into a human-centered design space to really lead, to serve, and to learn. Just to pull out two little examples, one of the things, because of our service, learning, and leadership model, civic engagement powers all of our local work. But when we look at the relationship between a sense of trust for your neighbors and feeling like your neighbors are willing to help, we see a correlation with higher levels of civic engagement. So that speaks to dignity, a sense of trust, a sense of feeling that others are willing to help. How does that reinforce your experience of dignity within the world and then drive your ability to engage civically in a positive way towards improving child well-being? Next, when we look at collective efficacy, which we would describe as the ability for a group of people in a community to exert informal ways of social control, we find that feeling a part of your neighborhood, a sense of belonging, is correlated with higher degrees of feeling like you can affect change as a group, believing that your actions make a difference, and civic engagement. So we also find that the way in which you are experiencing community, the way in which dignity is being reflected for you in your community, also drives a collective property about the ability to affect change. So finally, I'd just like to share, as we open into discussion, if we center on dignity, the dignity of individuals, not forgetting children, the dignity of groups, the dignity of communities, what would we do differently? Thank you all.
Renee and Nakatris, thank you so much for just continuing to share your wisdom and experience with this network. So as I mentioned previously, earlier, please feel free to add your questions, and we will answer the questions in the order that they're received. And so you can do that using the question box on the chat. A question has just come in from Katie Ports. It says, are the statistics on civic engagement and collective efficacy published? Renee, could you respond to that?
Oh, they are not published yet, but they are available on our website data dashboard. So they're publicly available on our data dashboard at Vital Village. And if you email us, if you can't find those there, just please email and we'll share.
So I've had another question come in, and Nakatris, maybe you can start with this one. Can you share an example of how one community is integrating the dignity framework in their work, perhaps to address structural root causes of trauma or adverse childhood experiences?
Sure. So I think that the best example that I can think of is there is a state agency actually that is working with a number of communities across the state, and what they are doing is what we call their dignity work. So spending time with staff, volunteers on all levels. So that's another big and important part, that in doing this, anybody involved in this space needs to be doing the same work. So in doing the dignity work, thinking about complex self-awareness, practicing radical empathy. And I actually want to pause on practicing radical empathy, because people talk about empathy a lot and we really need to get to a point where we put ourselves in each other's shoes. But practicing radical empathy is thinking about how you fundamentally change your perspective from judgmental to appreciation, not even accepting or tolerating, but how do you appreciate people that you might not have had information about, or you might have been operating in ignorance in terms of how you understood a population or experiences of someone, in an attempt to get to a more authentic place where we connect with ourselves and with other people. Doing that ensures that our community moves in a completely different way. So watching this organization do that means that not only are they able to address very clear issues of poverty in the community that they're serving, but they've also been able to address issues of relationship, issues of self-determination, honesty. And again, you can't give that to somebody, but you can create space where it can be restored. So people feeling like I do have the power to make choices for my family. The choices that I'm making are a choice that's okay. And I'm doing the best I can with what I have. And sometimes when I don't have what I need, me saying what that is makes sense. And then I'm not going to be judged by telling someone that I don't have this and I'm not sure how to get it. So the organization is spending time really doing that, and also challenging their own beliefs despite good intentions. So something that happens in a lot of community work and civic engagement is that everybody's there because they want better. Nobody's walking around like, oh, I wish it would. Everybody wants the problems to go away, but a lot of them are structural. So we have to get to the point where you challenge your own beliefs about something. What does it look like for you to think differently about why things are happening? A lot of times, individually, we spend time, we've already decided, we walk into our jobs, into community organizing meetings, already this is an issue. There's too much crime on my block, and there's poor people doing X, Y, and Z on my block, around my block. They're coming into my neighborhood. They're coming into my school. And the reality is they're not coming into anywhere. They live on your block. They're in our communities in very different ways. And by that very different ways, they might work there, they might live there, they must drive through there because if that's the way you get someplace. And I think that we ignore that. And so this organization is spending time really doing through self-assessment and then action planning. So everybody in their organization, as well as those who are currently receiving any type of service or volunteering with the organization, change how they've done onboarding with people coming in and how they've done exit interviews with people leaving, in terms of how I restore dignity, what my dignity work looks like and what I'm doing, where I'm struggling, and then creating very specific action plans that change the way they serve, not changing the services offered, doesn't change their grant cycle, doesn't change how they might organize and, to interact with the police force or the city council, but it does change the way that they implement some of their programming in terms of who says hello, how they say hello, what is offered when someone is waiting, how appointments are handled, how in-home visits are handled, how they're handled, not necessarily what happens during them. And so it has, they've just been doing that for about the last 6 months to kind of like dig into it, but they've already seen some changes in some of the offices that they're working in because it's a huge shift. And just being able to think that the people that we have the delight of working with, it's actually a delight, no matter who they are, where they're from, and really creating human interaction that allows everyone to really dig into what it means for them, myself, how can I be a decent human being to every other human being that I come in contact with.
Thank you so much, Nicatress. We've had a few questions coming in, so we'll continue to go in order. This one comes from Jennifer. She says, I'm an epidemiology student and would like to hear more about how social epidemiology can and should engage with addressing ACEs and structural inequities. How do we address individual dignity within the large population level studies to clarify association and eventually causation of structural inequities within ACEs? There's a little bit more. Can data help support the actualization of dignity and address the areas of the iceberg below the waterline, and what are some of the potential pitfalls? And so I will leave that up to perhaps Renee to start, and maybe Nicatress if there's anything you might like to add to that.
Well, Jennifer, I'm excited to hear some of the work that you'll be doing and some of your ideas, because the truth is I think we all are working very hard on this, and there is more to go. We don't have perfect metrics. We don't have, perfect tools, but we do have some bright spots. So I would direct you to some of the work of Felton Earls. He is one of the few people who, through the work that they did on the Project on Human Development in Chicago neighborhoods, it's a really comprehensive look at community, ecosystem, family, interpersonal exposure to violence and other forms of adversity, but also neighborhood properties like social cohesion, collective efficacy, social isolation. And one of the things he did following that study was an intervention study in Tanzania, looking at ways of building collective efficacy at the community level, which has not been studied very often. But if you think about it, collective efficacy would be a factor or collective factor in a community that would help protect, preserve, and promote a sense of dignity, your ability to take action informally to improve your environment and circumstances along with your peers. So it's not an individual property, but it's a community property. And one thing that they found by engaging young people in performance, community performance in the public square to help teach about the HIV virus, was that increased a sense of collective efficacy in the community. It also changed adults' perceptions and perspectives on the value and contribution of young people as citizens in the community. So again, we're seeing this interaction between your behaviors, your opportunities, and the way in which you can recognize and be validated and as a worthy and valuable human being. And so I think that is a good space to look into for some promising ideas.
Great. Thank you, Renee, and thank you for that question. Here's another question coming to us from Artie. It says, are there lived experiences within networks where they are addressing how to handle conflict in families, in work, and in community? Renee, perhaps you might like to start with that one.
I'm happy to kick it off. One of the things we're doing locally in Vital Village is something called social justice mediation. It is a program where people participate in a social justice mediation training institute. It's a 40-hour training. And then they utilize that in a variety of different ways, as professionally, personally, or as volunteer mediators within their communities and or schools, within their social groups and environments. And one of the things that we are learning from leaning into ways in which there isn't a neutrality to any practice. So if we think of mediation, we often think of it as just a wonderful neutral practice. It's a way to resolve conflicts peacefully. But the reason why we've leaned into a model by Leah Wing and Deepika that has a social justice emphasis is to help us unpack all of the ways in which there can be implicit biases, but also multiple stories, multiple frameworks, multiple multi-partiality, multiple ways of having your identity show up and influence your experience. And so mediation could be a process that can undermine a sense of dignity or worthiness if you are not sensitive to or taking account of that. So that's just an example of a way in which we are trying to actualize and really leaning into learning about the benefit of sharing and having more and more neighbors in the community that are familiar with a practice such as this, can adapt it, can modify it, and can utilize it to peacefully resolve conflicts.
Fantastic. Thank you, Renee. Our next question comes to us from Anna. This is specifically for Nakatra. She says, could you speak to self-liberation and taking power versus working within existing dominant systems to address injustice? And she says, I think we need both, and I'm curious where you think resources are best invested to push change. And that one was specifically for Nakatra.
I am here, and I'm about to answer it. I was trying to answer both parts of the question. Can you repeat the first part of the question for me, please?
Yeah, the first part was, could you speak to self-liberation and taking power versus working within existing dominant systems to address injustice?
So I do think that we do need to do both. And so I'll just talk about how I feel like Ubuntu maybe trying to handles that at this moment, is that we unfortunately probably compartmentalize it a little bit. And so there are spaces where we are much more adamant about what a structure will look like. And this is why we're doing it. And this is in terms of taking power. And this is thinking about doing it in a way that ensures that there's no humiliation. So we talk a lot about power and humiliation, because part of a lot of structural power does put people in a space of humiliation. And so creating structure that doesn't exist. And then in spaces where we aren't in a role where we're like, hey, this is not something that we've created, talking about it, bringing it to a table, bringing it to a community meeting, bringing it to a circle, bringing it to wherever we are in ways that we are included, and talking about what it looks like to interrupt some of power dynamics that aren't healthy for everybody in the space, and shedding light on it, oftentimes out loud and outright. I will also say, just from lived experience or professional experience, there's also been times where that didn't make sense, because doing that means that you might be uninvited from a space. And so figuring out how you can best understand a power dynamic in order to assist others. And sometimes that's removing yourself. So I do know that there's been times where the self-liberation part means like I have to remove myself from this space, and this is why I'm removing myself from this space. So it's clear that it's why I'm leaving. I feel like in times we've talked about, again, as an organization, how many times people leave a space because of power dynamics, because of oppressive mechanisms that are in an organization or even a community organizing space. And we don't talk about why we left, and we don't talk about it in a very clear, succinct, and like public way. But because you're removing yourself from the situation, are there times when you can? And also, how can you engage accomplices? So not allies who are like, yes, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm behind you 100% of the way, but someone who is in a spot where they are not being oppressed or marginalized because of the power dynamics, or an oppressive procedure, policy, or in any way, shape, or form, and they understand and are willing to put themselves in a space to say the same thing, because their ramifications for saying something wouldn't be anywhere near what mine would be. And so I think that in many cases we've created relationships with accomplices in many different ways. As an organization that's run by Black women, we have accomplices in a whole bunch of different communities that I think would that will stand up when we have a situation and say why this doesn't make sense, and they won't be ostracized the way that we would. So one is they both need to happen. And how do you do them simultaneously? We've compartmentalized them, but I do think you can do it in a way that's not compartmentalized. That would be ideal, right? To get to a place where, moving towards liberation, we are constantly moving in those spaces and helping people recognize what they say and how it marginalizes others. And then two, really building relationships with and developing accomplices. I think that it's actually not as hard as it has been in the past to develop a relationship or build an ally base, but to help allies understand what accomplice work looks like, and helping them get to that point, because there are a lot who are willing to do it, but they just have no idea what the difference is and how much more work it could be for them, even though there's not necessarily danger in it. So for them, in terms of their livelihood or their work. So I think those are probably the two ways that we address them head on.
Thank you so much, Nakatris. I'm so excited. There are a plethora of questions continuing to come in. Unfortunately, we only have time for maybe two more questions if we breeze through these through our answers. So I'm going to take a question from Stephanie, and this is a two-part question. She says, "How do you suggest educators begin this work?" She says, "I don't know where to start other than with my own actions, modeling what I would like to see in others, listening without judgment, etc." So part one is, where do you start? And then part two to that question is social justice mediation like restorative justice? And Renee, perhaps
I'd love to make a quick answer to this, because I know Nakatris will have a lot to share. First of all, Stephanie, congratulations to you. I can say personally, to me, what has been most rewarding to me, trained as a pediatrician, has been the opportunity to work with educators over the past few years. And that's been the place where I found the most joy and opportunity, in part because of the very valued role you play in the lives of children and the amount of time you're able to spend with children. And so I think the messaging is wrong in the value we place on educators and education in our society, and everything we've learned about ACEs and structural violence further reinforce how wrong that messaging is and how much we've undervalued the importance of environments that invest and take an interest in children, and how critically valuable that is to your social emotional development and well-being, and is healing like no other medicine. So I would say you're beginning right at the right place. You do want to build partnerships with a variety of leaders within your school and school system, because that will be important over time, but there's no place too small to start. And there are a lot of wonderful models out there in early childhood education, junior high, and high school education. And so be happy to share with you some of those offline. And then finally, social justice mediation is different than restorative justice. I think they have a complementarity nature in that the striving is to have a process where dignity and relationships are valued, and the process by which we communicate and work with each other is considered, but they approach it slightly differently.
Wonderful. So
Can I just add one thing?
Yep, go right ahead.
So, in thinking about education, when we talk about doing this in a school building, we always talk about doing it in your classrooms, in hallways, and then in staff meetings or teacher lounges, because those are the three places that seem to be like they're treated differently, right? So it sounds like you already have your classroom is the place where all that modeling is happening and young people are being taught and engaged in that way. In hallways, thinking about ways to interrupt student interaction that doesn't support that. And even if it's as simple as just like, hey, don't say that, that's not appropriate language, that was offensive, and keep moving. And then also calling in staff. Like oftentimes in meetings, whether it's a staff school board, a school department, or even a district meeting, there are things said and you see how people feel uncomfortable about it. But in talking to educators, a lot of people are uncomfortable with how they can handle calling other educators in, calling them out to call them in, right? To change their own behavior that would then help create a community where everybody feels safe and valued in a school building. And so spending some time to figure that out. We did do a webinar, and Ubuntu did, and it's on our website about just how to interrupt language. And we've done that particular model in a number of schools, and it's helping. So I would say like figuring out how to use language in terms of calling peers out to call them in.
Thank you, Nakatris. So I have time for one last question, and this question comes to us from May. It says, how can we balance radical empathy as we deal with trauma, both historical and current, especially for communities of color and indigenous communities?
So I would just share very, very briefly that I think there are ways of thinking that are linear and ways of thinking that are nonlinear. And when we think about trauma and the healing process, we have to have an appreciation that it's a nonlinear healing process. And if we have that appreciation, I think your question may becomes even more profound as to how much an intention there needs to be to embrace and have radical empathy, because a non-linear healing process might mean there's steps forward, there regressions, there challenges, there's growth that occurs in certain ways, but there's also a healing, that there's a real process to the healing that isn't necessarily step by step up the ladder. And so I think that that's really important. And I think when we think about historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, one place where I've found a lot of eye-opening and mind-opening is not to think about time in a linear way as well, but to really think about the ways in which history, our trauma may have been historical, but our healing is not necessarily occurring in a linear way. And so appreciating the presence of history and the influence of history in the current moment and the way in which the future will be realized is really important.
Thank you so much, Renee. And thank you to both Renee and Nakatris for spending some time with us and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. I know there were a few questions we didn't get to, so I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to those on this particular webinar, but please head over to networksofopportunity.org and join us on the forum or via Twitter. Or our email address that's up on the screen. We'd love to continue the conversation and open it up to the broader network. Thank you all of our participants for joining us and spending time with us today. We really appreciate the work that you're doing in your communities. So with that in mind, please note that we will be sharing a recording and a link to this webinar so that you can continue to share it, which will also be available on the Now Innovation Forum. So with that in mind, we are sending you off with light and good energy, and have a wonderful rest of your day and continue doing the great work that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.